another major development on Capitol Hill involving Senator Mark Kelly and other lawmakers, talking about the failed potentially indictment of them. Let's take you out to this report here on Live Now from Fox about this. Democratic lawmakers, that indictment falling apart. Let's listen in to this report.
A major victory for the Democrats after grand jurors in the nation's capital declined to indict 6 Democratic lawmakers over a controversial video urging U.S. service members to refuse illegal orders.
This is a victory for the Constitution of the United States.
While it's still unclear what charges prosecutors were pursuing and if the indictment involved all 6 Democrats, its failure prompted strong reactions from those involved.
If these do think they're going to intimidate and bully me and get me to back down from doing my duty, they have another thing coming.
Senators Mark Kelly, Alyssa Slotkin, and the 4 congressional lawmakers who participated in the video have denied any criminal wrongdoing. All 6 now vowing to fight back.
There will be accountability, and they should be preserving documents, preparing for what's coming.
The video, released last fall, sparked anger from the president and his aides, who described it as seditious behavior in a series of posts online shortly after a federal probe was launched, leading Democrats to accuse the president of abuse of power.
This is straight from the authoritarian playbook.
And while the Justice Department hasn't commented on the court setback, shortly after the news broke, the Speaker of the House did weigh in.
Look, I think that anytime you're obstructing law enforcement and getting in the way of these sensitive operations, it's a very serious thing, and it probably is a crime, and yeah, they probably should be indicted.
Gernal Scott, Fox News.
All right. Thank you so much for that report. Some major developments, not only around that partial looming government shutdown, but even more. We also heard today from President Trump a major development as they revoked a scientific finding that long has been the central basis for U.S. action to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and fight climate change. This is the most aggressive move by a president to roll back climate regulations. For more on this, let's go out to Mike Emanuel with this report.
You're going to get a car that starts easier, a car that works better for a lot less money.
Greenhouse gases emitted from cars, trucks, and power plants will no longer be federally regulated as the Trump administration reverses an Obama-era ruling known as the endangerment finding.
The 2009 Obama EPA endangerment finding led to trillions of dollars in regulations that strangled entire sectors of the United States economy.
For nearly 2 decades, the federal government has regulated those emissions after the Environmental Protection Agency determined greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health and could be regulated under the Clean Air Act. But President Trump argues the finding is unnecessarily expensive and threatens American energy dominance.
Under the endangerment finding, they forced the hated start-stop feature onto American consumers, which unnecessarily shuts off a car's engine when you stop at a red light.
The White House says the repeal will save Americans roughly $1.3 trillion, in part by making new vehicles cheaper. But critics argue any short-term gains would ignore the longer-term impact of climate pollution.
The repeal will hurt kids with asthma. The repeal will hurt homeowners and destabilize insurance markets.
The repeal is likely to face legal challenges since the Supreme Court affirmed that greenhouse gases are air pollutants subject to Clean Air Act regulation. In Washington, Mike Emanuel, Fox News.
All right, thank you so much. And of course, that endangerment finding is really the basis, the underpinning from that Obama administration of nearly all climate regulations, and a major move by the president today. Rapid Response posting this as well, talking about that, the basis that the radical left activists used to justify over $1.3 trillion in crushing regulations on American families and businesses. This is the single largest deregulatory action in U.S. history. Let's be joined right now here on Live Now from Fox for more on what this means by Vice President of Notice, Derek Morgan. Derek, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And this was a major move by President Trump and the White House. What does it signal to you?
It signals to me this president is dead serious about taking a good look at the science, and he's on very firm ground, both legally, scientifically, and economically, to turn back this endangerment finding. It had led to fewer choices for Americans, it had led to higher energy prices. This is going to help consumers and help America be much more competitive in the race with China.
And obviously, he mentioned that just the impact on American businesses, American families, the American dream. And in terms of the real effects, how would overturning this impact regulations on cars, power plants, methane emissions? How would it have real impacts?
Yeah, on its own, it doesn't do any of those things, but it enables all of those things. And so he's already taken steps to overturn the EV mandate that California and some other states had put forward to force everybody into an electric vehicle, even if they don't want one. So he'd already done some of that. And the power plan that President Obama and then President Biden both supported to get rid of coal completely, he had already started to undo that. This takes it out by the roots and says you don't have the endangerment finding, you don't have any foundation to do these new rules. And we think he's on good legal, scientific, and economic grounds to do this.
All right, and obviously we talk about this. You mentioned states like California. They have some stricter, of the strictest climate laws out there. How would this impact states like that, and how might other states now jump in the game in terms of this legislation, seeing as this endangerment finding has been revoked?
Yeah, states will have a limited amount of things that they can do. They can always look to protect the environment from their point of view, but they can't interrupt interstate commerce. And that's where California really went wrong, is they had decided on their own that they were going to ban internal combustion engine vehicles. And not only that, but also lawn equipment. I mean, can you imagine being in the lawn service industry and having to use electric lawnmowers? They just don't do the job for them. So this is really going to help working people too. The fact is that California had a special way that they could petition to try to have these special rules. Both Obama and Biden had allowed that. Trump, before in his first term, did not allow it. And now with this endangerment finding gone, he's really closing the door and to protect Americans from coast to coast from the worst, most draconian environmental rules like this.
Yeah, and obviously public health also at the central portion of this. And you said it doesn't really impact the direct things, but it's on the path to lower gas prices, as President Trump said, electricity bills, air quality. How quickly could that happen with this? Is it a long-term plan?
It is indeed. Part of this is that industry is going to have to recalibrate. You're already seeing this with General Motors. You're seeing this with Ford. They have gotten clear feedback from their customers that while some do like EVs, for the bulk of people, they actually like the internal combustion engine. They want to continue to have that option. So you're seeing massive write-downs in the auto industry from particularly those two companies, but also Stellantis and some others. And the fact is that what the president's done is he said government isn't going to have its thumb on the scale. People want to have EVs, that's fine, but we're not going to mandate it, and we're not going to do what the previous administration was doing, which is to make it much more expensive to have an internal combustion engine car. So effectively, everybody who was buying an F1 pickup truck was subsidizing those who were buying Tesla. He said, enough of that. Let's let Americans come to terms with what they want in the marketplace and let freedom reign.
Yeah, and obviously all those car manufacturers having, like you mentioned, to recalibrate that, and that take some time because production for cars in 2027 already in production. I do want to ask you, because your background is in someone about the fuel, about petrochemicals. You've testified before Congress about that sort of thing. In terms of the certain gases, everyone talks about carbon dioxide, but should these potentially have been split up into harmful greenhouse gases versus others that could be impacted to public health?
Absolutely. And you hit your nail on the head here. The Clean Air Act actually lists out the chemicals that it's concerned about, and carbon dioxide is not one of them. Carbon dioxide is ubiquitous. It uniformly mixes in the atmosphere on a global level. So it's not like these other pollutants that are specific to a place and are lethal to human life. All of this is built upon the theory and by complex computer models that, by the way, over the last 20 years, have not been able to replicate what's actually happening. So, 25 years ago or so, we got really concerned that these models were showing that increasing percentage of carbon dioxide was going to lead to catastrophic global warming. We just haven't seen that. So you do very much have to treat it differently. And the bottom line is something this massive, the Supreme Court has told us it needs to be Congress looking into it, not unelected bureaucrats at the EPA.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And of course, the EPA very much front and center for this. Lee Zeldin there at this press conference today. And he posted on social media saying Trump's EPA historic action today, the single largest action of deregulation in the history of the United States, will save Americans $2,400 for a new vehicle. During that press conference, they talked about the stop and start feature. The price is also an impact. Is there anything else that might be changing with this deregulation that you can speak to?
Yeah, I'm really hopeful that it will just open up choices. You know, hybrid vehicles in particular have proved very popular. If you look at an automaker like Toyota, for example, much of their lineup, even their #1 sedan, their minivan, are only hybrids now. But so many of their cars, you can get it in a hybrid version, you can get it in a plug-in version, or you can get an internal combustion engine version. And I think you're going to see that more in the marketplace, more options that people can decide what works best for them. And that always makes sense. Forcing everyone to electric vehicles just doesn't make sense. You've got long journeys. If you're, taxi cab or you're driving Uber, you don't want to have to stop for an hour and a half or 2 hours in the middle of the day to try to get fueled up.
And obviously, President Trump making this announcement, but you can only imagine what the litigation is going to look like over the next years, decades, potentially. And really, this endangerment finding, the underpinning of a 2007 case, the Obama administration talking about this climate regulations. They ruled on that in 2007. 2012, they did not decide to hear a case in a similar fashion. Do you think the Supreme Court potentially could be involved in this? And does that potentially concern you with the Trump administration, the uncertainty of it all?
Well, I do think it's ultimately going to be decided by the courts, but we've got some really good rulings in recent years. The 2007 case that you mentioned, Massachusetts versus EPA, said that EPA had to decide one way or another on carbon dioxide. So this isn't necessarily in conflict with that. Later cases, like the West Virginia versus the EPA case, said when you have massive questions of redoing entire sectors of the economy, you can't get that out of obscure language in a statute. It has to be very, very clear. And so it's called the major questions doctrine. So I think the more recent case, the EPA versus West Virginia versus EPA, indicates that really the Supreme Court's going to take a look at this and say, this law, the Clean Air Act, written many decades ago, did not foresee this circumstance. It can't be stretched so far that you're redoing the entire economy of the United States. So I feel pretty confident that President Trump ultimately will prevail in that case.
All right, and then one of my last questions before I let you go here, Derek, is about some of the inconsistencies, some of the uncertainties around this, because we saw it similar with tariffs, how companies had been living a certain way and then tariffs come down, they have to recalibrate that. The legal system, Supreme Court might hear a case about that as well. Does that concern you, where there are uncertainties, where this is before and then if the court strikes it down, they'll have to revert? Does that concern you? Does that potentially concern auto manufacturers and others?
I think it does. Businesses will tell you they need certainty, but there's nothing more uncertain than basing your business plan on a favorable law. They really have to just keep their eye on the ball and what do consumers ultimately want. Ultimately, the consumers, thank God, we're 250 years into this country. The people have a say. And the people voted for Donald Trump. And part of what he campaigned on very, very clearly was rejecting the Green New Deal that was trying to force everybody into electric vehicles and was taking off entire fuel sources from our electricity supply at a time when we really need it to gear up for AI race with China. And so the people have spoken, and ultimately the people will speak. So you've got to go after what do the consumers want? What do they expect? What's the good value proposition, rather than chasing subsidies or other things that can change so suddenly.
Obviously, President Trump calling this the biggest deregulatory effect in U.S. history. And we talk about this being some almost 20 years ago. In 20 years in the future now, where do we stand? How will this have real impacts? Where are we at 20 years from now?
Well, I think the U.S. is going to be in a much better position. Now, key to this will be to have real permitting reform, which is another thing that President Trump has talked about. If we get that permitting reform and we're allowing all the fuels to compete, everything from coal to renewables, nuclear, certainly gas, all of those, if they can all compete, we have so many plentiful resources in the United States. If we have that permitting reform that makes sense, we'll be able to build the electricity here, not have a bad impact on prices for our consumers, and be able to have the AI and data center infrastructure here in the United States that will ensure that AI is dominated by America and not by China.
And you can only imagine what it looks 20 years down the road. That feels so far in the future, but obviously what happened in 2009 still impacts in 2026. What happens in potentially the 2040s have impacts from today. All right, Derek, thank you so much. I appreciate your time here on Live Now from Fox.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you so much. A great insight there here into this new deregulatory effect from the president, the endangerment finding there dating back to 2009, the EPA rescinding it. We're also hearing from the other side of the aisle. We're hearing from President Barack Obama, central to a lot of these climate regulations. As he said on social media today, the Trump administration repealed the endangerment finding, the ruling that served as the basis for limits on tailpipe emissions, power plant rules. Without it, we'll be less safe, less healthy, and less able to fight climate change. Also, the fossil fuel industry can make even more money.